Welcome to Midnight Grove, where stories whisper through time and the past is never truly lost. Tonight's tale, The House That Remembers You, follows Margot, a woman looking for a fresh start in a quiet coastal town. She moves into an old house on the cliffs, expecting solitude. But the house has other plans. Small things begin appearing. A book left open to a familiar page, a coffee cup still warm, a locked door that shouldn't open. And then she finds a photograph hidden in the floorboards. A photograph of herself, but it's from decades before she was born. As she unravels the mystery, Margot realizes the house does not just remember the past, it remembers her. And it has been waiting for her return. So settle in, close your eyes, and let the story unfold. Chapter 1. The House on the Cliffs. Margot had never believed in haunted houses. She had spent most of her life in cities, surrounded by glass buildings, honking traffic, and streets that never truly went quiet. But when she saw the listing for the house on the cliffs, small, quiet, isolated, something in her chest had whispered, "Go." She didn't know why, only that at this point in her life she needed stillness. A place to breathe, a place to start over. And so she packed up her things. And she moved into a house that was waiting for her, a house that had been waiting for years, a house that feels lived in. The first thing Margot noticed was the smell. Not a bad smell, but not empty either. The air inside held a faint, lingering scent of coffee and old paper, as if someone had been reading in the next room just moments before she arrived. Which was strange, because the house had been empty for years. She wandered through the rooms, running her fingers along the old wooden banister, the deep blue walls, the worn bookshelves. Everything was still, and yet it felt as if at any moment she might turn a corner and find someone standing there. Margot exhaled, shaking her head. She was imagining things. The house was just a house, wasn't it? The book she didn't remember reading. That night Margot unpacked the essentials, clothes, coffee, her favorite books. She was settling onto the couch with a blanket when she noticed something on the side table. A book, hardcover, a deep emerald green. She frowned. She hadn't unpacked this book, and yet the crease in the spine was exactly where she would have stopped reading. She ran her fingers over the cover. She opened to the marked page. And the strangest thing was, she knew the words, not just in the way you recognize a story you've read before, but in the way you remember something you once lived. Margot's heart skipped a beat, because suddenly she wasn't sure if she had found this book, or if it had found her. A house that remembers. The first night she told herself it was nothing. But then more things started appearing. A coffee cup on the counter, still warm. A knitted throw blanket draped over the armchair, as if someone had just gotten up. A photograph, tucked between the floorboards. She picked it up carefully. And when she turned it over, her stomach dropped, because it was her standing on the front porch, decades before she was born. Chapter 2. The Photograph in the Floorboards. Margot stared at the photograph in her hand. It was old, the edges curling, the paper faded with time. And yet the image was clear. A woman stood on the porch of the house, her house, and she looked exactly like Margot. A face that shouldn't exist. Margot traced the woman's face with her thumb. The resemblance was uncanny. Same dark eyes, same sharp cheekbones. Even the way she stood, one hand resting lightly on the porch railing, was too familiar. Her chest tightened. This had to be a mistake. Maybe it was a relative she never knew. A distant ancestor who had once lived in this house. Or maybe she had been here before. She swallowed hard. That was impossible. She had never set foot in this town before the day she moved in. Had she? The locked room. The house was quiet as she moved through the halls, the old wooden floors creaking under her steps. She had spent the whole first day here, walking through every room, or almost every room. At the end of the upstairs hallway, there was a single locked door. She had assumed it was a storage closet, but now she wasn't so sure. Her fingers hovered over the brass handle. She twisted. Locked. She exhaled, pressing her forehead lightly against the wood. It felt strange standing here, like something on the other side was waiting, watching. She shuddered and stepped back. She'd deal with it later. Right now she needed answers. The town that knows more than it says. The next morning Margot drove into town. It was a small coastal place, the kind where people notice newcomers. And today they noticed her. She could feel it in the way the shopkeeper at the cafe hesitated before handing her change. The way an older man on the sidewalk paused mid-step as if trying to place her. The way a woman's eyes widened slightly when Margot asked for directions to the local records office. Finally, she couldn't take it anymore. She turned to the barista behind the cafe counter. "Is there a reason everyone's looking at me like I'm a ghost?" she asked, forcing a light tone. The barista, maybe mid-40s, salt and pepper hair pulled into a loose ponytail, hesitated. Then finally she sighed. "It's just..." The woman studied her carefully. "You look like someone we used to know." Margot's stomach tightened. Who?" The woman hesitated. Then in a voice just above a whisper she said, "Margaret." Margot's breath caught. "That's my name." The barista nodded slowly. "I know." A chill ran down Margot's spine, because she had never introduced herself. The woman who was forgotten. The records office was small and cluttered, the scent of dust and yellowed paper thick in the air. Margot scanned the shelves, searching for anything. Old census records, property deeds, anything that might tell her who Margaret was. And then she found it. An old newspaper clipping, folded and tucked inside a leather-bound ledger. Her fingers trembled as she unfolded it, and there was her own face. A grainy black and white photograph. A woman standing on the porch of her house. Margot's breath hitched. Her stomach twisted. It wasn't just the same house. It wasn't just someone who looked like her. The name beneath the photo was Margaret Holloway. She read the headline. "Woman disappears from Cliffside Home, 1952. Margot's blood ran cold. The woman in the picture, she hadn't just lived in the house, she had vanished from it. And now Margot was standing in her place. The house that waits. She drove home in silence, her mind racing. The house loomed ahead as she pulled into the driveway, its windows reflecting the gray afternoon light. It felt different now, like she wasn't moving into it. Like she was coming back. She stepped inside, the door clicking shut behind her. The air was thick, heavy. And then a sound, a creaking floorboard upstairs. Margot froze. The house was supposed to be empty. She turned toward the staircase, her pulse hammering. And then, from the end of the hallway, behind the locked door, a voice. Soft, distant, almost familiar, calling her name. Margot. She sucked in a sharp breath. And the lock on the door clicked open. Chapter 3, The Room That Shouldn't Exist. The lock on the upstairs door clicked open. Margot's breath caught in her throat. She took a step back. The house was silent now. No more voices, no more creaking floorboards. Just the door slightly ajar, waiting. Her fingers trembled as she reached for the handle. The wood was cold. She pushed the door open, and the past rushed in. The room that time forgot. The air inside was thick with dust and something older. A faint scent of lavender and old books, of rain that had dried long ago. And inside, the room wasn't empty. It was a bedroom, and it had been left untouched. The furniture was covered in a fine layer of dust, but nothing had been packed away. A bed with a quilt neatly folded at the foot. A vanity mirror, its glass slightly warped with age. A wooden dresser with a porcelain perfume bottle still resting on top. It was as if someone had meant to return, as if the room had been waiting. Margot swallowed hard. She stepped forward. Her reflection flickered in the mirror. For a brief second, she swore she saw not herself, but someone else. A woman with the same face, dressed in 1950s silk and pearls. Margot blinked, and the vision was gone. Her heart thudded. What was happening to her? The letter in the drawer. Her hands shook as she reached for the dresser. She hesitated, then pulled open the top drawer. Inside, beneath a yellowed lace handkerchief, was a single envelope. The paper was brittle with age, the ink slightly faded, and written on the front in looping cursive, Margaret Holloway. Margot's pulse roared in her ears. She turned it over. Unsealed, she carefully slid the letter from the envelope and unfolded the fragile pages. She took a breath. And she read the last words she wrote. My dearest, if you are reading this, then something has gone wrong. Something I feared might happen, something I could never explain. The house remembers me, but I am beginning to remember it too. I am losing time. Some mornings I wake and feel as though the night never ended. Some evenings I sit at my vanity and stare at a reflection that does not belong to me. I feel as though I have lived this all before, but I do not know how or why. And I am afraid, because I do not think this house lets people leave. I can feel it, watching me, keeping me, writing me into its walls. I know I should run, but where would I go? How do you escape a story you've already lived? I can only hope if someone finds this letter, that they will understand what I could not, that they will remember before it is too late. Margot's hands shook as she reached the end of the letter. And then she turned it over. At the very bottom, scrawled hastily, almost frantic, was a final line, one that sent a chill down her spine. It's happening again. Margot sucked in a sharp breath. The paper slipped from her fingers, and behind her, a floorboard creaked. A ghost that wasn't a ghost. Margot spun around. The room was empty, but she knew she wasn't alone. Her reflection in the vanity mirror shimmered, and this time, when she saw the woman standing there, she didn't disappear. Margot's breath caught. She was seeing herself, but not herself. Margaret Holloway, the woman from the past, the woman who had disappeared. And she was looking directly at her. Margot took a shaky step forward. The woman in the mirror tilted her head. Their movements were no longer synchronized. This wasn't just a reflection. It was a memory, one still alive inside the house. Margot's pulse hammered. She whispered, "Who are you?" And the woman's lips, her lips, parted, and she spoke. "You already know." A sharp pain shot through Margot's head. Her vision blurred, and suddenly she was falling backward. The house remembers everything. Margot gasped. When she opened her eyes, she was no longer in the bedroom. She was outside. The sky was dark. The air smelled of salt and rain. And ahead of her, the cliffs loomed. The wind roared around her, sharp and unrelenting. And there, standing at the very edge, her dress billowing in the wind, was Margaret Holloway. Margot's breath hitched. She tried to move, but her body wouldn't respond. She could only watch. Margaret stood motionless, staring out at the waves below. Then, slowly, she turned, and Margot saw her face, tear-streaked, resigned, and somehow deeply familiar. Margaret met her eyes, and softly she whispered, "It's time to come home." Margot's vision blurred. The wind howled, and suddenly the world faded to black. Chapter 4. The Memory That Was Never Forgotten. Margot's eyes snapped open. She was lying on the wooden floor of the bedroom, her breath coming in sharp, uneven gasps. The room was exactly as it had been. The furniture untouched, the dust hanging in the air. But she knew something had changed, because now she remembered the life she had lived before. The cliffs, the wind, the woman standing at the edge. Margaret Holloway. She hadn't just disappeared. She had become Margot. The name was different. The time was different. But the soul was the same. A cycle turning over and over. She had lived this life before. And now she was living it again. Margot's breath hitched. "No," she whispered. It wasn't possible. She was her own person. Wasn't she? She stumbled to her feet, her head pounding. But the moment she turned toward the mirror, she froze. Because Margaret was still there. Her reflection wasn't her own anymore. And she was watching, waiting. Margot's hands clenched into fists. "Tell me why," she whispered. "Why am I here again?" Margaret's lips parted, and in a voice that was not just hers, but Margot's too, she spoke, "Because you never left." Margot's breath stopped, and suddenly, the house began to tremble. The house that wouldn't let go. The walls shuddered. The old chandelier above swayed, the glass shaking in its frame. The house was waking up. Margot clutched the dresser to steady herself. She could feel it, the house pulling her deeper, trying to write her back into its walls. It didn't just remember her. It needed her. She had been part of it once, and it wouldn't let her go again. Margot's pulse hammered. No, she gasped. She would not disappear again. Not like last time. Not like Margaret. She turned, and she ran. The final choice. The hallway blurred around her as she raced toward the front door. The air was heavy, thick, as if the house itself was trying to hold her back. The floorboards beneath her groaned. The walls breathed. And from behind her, a voice. Margot. She didn't turn. She didn't dare. She reached the door, her hands fumbling with the lock. It wouldn't budge. Her pulse pounded in her ears. The house wasn't going to let her go. Unless... Margot squeezed her eyes shut. "And then," she whispered it. The words she knew the house had been waiting to hear. "I remember." A beat of silence. Then, a sound like wind rushing through the halls. A sigh of relief. The weight in the air lifted, and the door unlocked. Margot wrenched it open and stepped outside. The house lets go. The cold night air hit her like a wave. She stumbled forward, her breath ragged, her heart pounding. When she turned back, the house was different. The windows dark and empty, the door slightly ajar, no longer waiting, no longer watching, because now it had let her go. Margot swallowed hard. She wasn't Margaret anymore. She was herself, and she had finally left, for good. The house that remembers. Somewhere deep within its walls the house settled. It had kept her once. It had brought her back again. And now it would wait, because houses do not forget. And one day she might return. Thank you for joining us at Midnight Grove for the house that remembers you. Margot thought she was moving into a new home. Instead, she found herself in a story she had already lived. Some places hold memories, others refuse to let them go. But tonight she made a choice. She broke the cycle. And sometimes that is the only way to truly leave. As you drift into sleep, may you remember that not all doors must be opened, not all echoes must be followed, and that you are always more than the past that tries to hold you. Sleep well, and we'll see you next time for another story.